Okay, so this recording is a bit of an embarrassing way for me to clean up I made a 2 hour recording, which maybe has some interesting facets in it, but it doesn't very thoroughly or directly contradict the points that I was trying to countermand. It doesn't very clearly and directly uh, provide or substitute for the misunderstanding that I'm rallying against. And so I'm going to revisit Sam Vaknin and revisit the sociological reductionists that I complain about, and I think I'm going to more cogently explain how this can generally be compiled into the intellectual field, or how it can be understood in terms of the academic's own language in some sense, because I do think that this is a failing of moral philosophy, and I can tell you exactly where I think where the best description of that failing lies. Because I'm very close to this field in moral philosophy myself. I'm very much in agreement with it, and then it has been maladapted, it has been corrupted, and I would say the core tenets of this thinking has been betrayed. So I am in much agreement with Catherine Elgin. I'm in much agreement with her epistemic responsibilism and epistemic agency. I'm on board. I really am. Then she starts talking about things that are not supported by her own papers, I would even say. And she's gotten onto a very rotten bandwagon. And when she talks off the cuff on these remarks, I mean, I've made recordings that rebuke her in the past. When she starts talking about epistemic injustice, this is a forbidden phrase. You cannot talk about epistemic injustice because how could you ever come across it? How could you ever know that it occurred? If the truth has been damaged, how can you say that how can you retrace the damage that has occurred? You can't. You can only hypothetically, metaphorically make some kind of zero sum extraction or something like that. You have to extract a pound of flesh as equal weight to the epistemic injustice that you're going to what? That you're going to fucking thumbsuck. It's disgusting. And by the way, it's also, I would say, very much in line with proto-fascism in some sense, because the only way to ground that is in some kind of fascist mentality of what has been fascistically lost in your identitarian collective group noun, or whatever. So you have this felt sense of loss in your lived experience. What utter garbage. I mean, this is narrative trash. Yes, you can maybe say, well, yeah, if we can look at how we can be sympathetic to historical injustice or something like that. So let's extrapolate from that there's epistemic injustice. You've gone too far, Mr. Fascist. Now you are basically a Nazi philosopher at that point when you go into that kind of garbage. Demanding sympathy for your fucking narrative that you can't, how can you describe that you have had epistemic injustice done to your group? You can't even say that it's done to you as an individual, it's done to your group. So somehow moral consideration is vested into the group identity. It's fucking disgusting. So in some sense, the qualia, the essential source of all moral consideration, becomes these general categories, become these hive mentalities that humanity gets adopted by. And look, if you want to say that your culture had something that was special and then it was stolen from it, now look, there are things that can be done to groups. And I'm not saying that there can't be things that are done to groups. So something that cannot be done to a group is epistemic injustice. Because either then you're saying that the truth needs to be compensated for by some other mechanism that has nothing to do with the truth. So you are basically a kind of epistemic pluralist because you're saying that no, we need social justice to make up for the epistemic injustice. And these things are not the same thing. By definition, they can't be the same thing, because if the truth has been damaged, what is the recourse? What is the reconciliation if you're going to substitute it for something else that's not epistemic in nature? So somehow you have to have a fake social infusion of something that you're going to reify as being of the same weight as the same, and then you get into these problems of unknown quantities, essentially. That is, you've got a formula that you are fudging, by the way, and you have no idea when to stop, but you say, no, well, this is roughly in the formula of the solution. And this is the magical thinking that I think Sam Vaknin... Look, Sam Vaknin is a mixed bag to me, because if I watch his whole video now, which I have, he says a lot of beautiful things that can be repurposed. But I again say that he is poisoned by his general intellectual amorality to some degree, and he is somewhat, a lot of his reductionism, a lot of his sociological reductionism is for me, it crosses lines and things like that, in much the same way that he just kind of conflates epistemic injustice as something. I mean, in some sense, look, you could say that he's just being a realist, because he's saying that, yeah, people don't have the intellectual capacity to distinguish and know essentially when they're crossing these lines, and it's for intellectuals to kind of pick up the pieces after the fact. So I'm somewhat sympathetic to his position, but I do think that he's failing, because he could be extolling proper morality, and he could be, let's say, setting up these lines in the sand, at least to be crossed by people, but instead he just kind of, I do think also he makes some of his historical reductionism, or some of his sociological reductionism, I think it's true, but it's not true. Like the idea that we're going to have gender wars and stuff like that. I mean, I think that's a fair prediction to make, but in some sense, some of the claims that he makes to support that motif, I think, is a bit unfounded in some sense. The idea that, oh well, women have more degrees than men, therefore they're going to do better, or something like that, because it is still how educated you are in terms of degrees is still the biggest indicator for income, or something like that. I think that whole sort of supposition is a bit dubious, um, especially as the quality of the academy has essentially. I mean, it's in some sense you have to look at also the type of degree. I mean, like, so if we're just looking at STEM, and we say, well, how many women are getting STEM degrees? I think that might undermine that whole thesis that Sam Vaknin brings out there. So I do think that his narrative is just a little bit cherry picked, as it were. But this is what happens when you get mystified and transfixed by the narrative that you're just trying to kind of. I do think that there's an epistemic injustice bandwagon that people are demanding sympathy for, and Sam Vaknin has somewhat jumped on that bandwagon to some degree, and he can't stop himself from doing that, perhaps because he doesn't have, let's say, a sophisticated enough moral array to kind of. Look, I don't want to be too groping and insulting, but I do see the same theme repeated all over with intellects or intellectuals that I think are, they don't see their own immoral line crossing or something like that, and then they can forgive themselves and excuse themselves because they've got such an ample, general, formulaic, mechanical deconstruction of what's going on, and therefore they can kind of use that generalization to promulgate some kind of, well, we know that we just need to do something. We know that there's some kind of emergency, or something like that. I mean, okay, now I'm saying things that don't apply to Sam Vaknin, but they kind of maybe metaphorically could be applied to Sam Vaknin. in a kind of in another metric or another facet. But sorry, I'm kind of, I mean, I'm unfairly projecting democratic liberalism onto Sam Vaknin to make this argument, because, and in some sense I do think that maybe he is being a little bit too crafty, that he's trying to broaden his appeal by making these kinds of broad intellectual, or what I would say vague and embarrassing conflations and things like that. But I can almost forgive him, because then he says all the right things, and he says, well, this is how the masses respond to things, and it's only intellectuals that pick up the pieces after the fact, or something like that. And then he has this kind of material historical determinism as well. Again, I think that this is a bit too reductionist. This is a bit too broad, as if individuals have not changed history. I mean, there are things that have happened in history which are quite blatantly blips on the radar, that it's like, where did that come from? And in some sense, I think that this comes. Okay, so this is where I criticize Sam Vaknin for, is how he, in some sense, he's got a real, the fly in his stew, or what's the word, the fly in his ointment is Anglo-Saxon individual British liberalism, essentially. and he does go after them because he knows that they threaten his canonical narrative in some sense. They threaten his historical determinism or his geographical determinism or something like that. And in some sense, I think that, when he talks about Europe and he talks about the Germanic colonization of Europe and things like that, he's not lying about those things. Those are useful, maybe they're useful sociological, historical generalizations. And I rally against that. I rally against that reductionism. I rally against that kind of lowest common denominator sociological. I do think that we can actually do better. And I also think that, again, he attacks people that don't deserve to be attacked. To kind of lump Farage in with other people. And also there are other people in Europe that I think that excuse me for sounding like an Anglo-Saxon, Anglosphere sort of a white privileged person, but I don't fucking care about those narratives, so I'll defend myself intellectually for people that come after me on those grounds. But there is a difference between, let's say, the kind of Hindu nationalism in India and even Orban and Farage. There's a huge difference between that. And there's a tolerance in Christian culture. There are values and their tolerance. And to say that essentially, I do have a problem in let's say some kind of this gets a bit touchy in some sense, but in some sense, Christianity secularized itself to a large degree in the Protestant Reformation, blah blah blah. And you can say, well, now we're dealing with the aftermath of how that wasn't done well or something like that. Or I would say it's part of the Christian lineage or something like that. It's part of the, it's part of God's plan or something like that anyway. But I mean, I'm addressing this to Sam Vaknin, who's a bit of an atheist. But in some sense, my understanding of God is very different, I guess. I don't believe in the pagan sky father, but I believe that the spirit that animates all of us, the understanding, the consciousness, this is something that does attain towards a faith-based position. We need intuition. We cannot even have thoughts without intuition. It's not possible. Okay, that you cannot ground these things in material determinism. You need faith. And then you can talk about bad faith and good faith, and faith that gets along and faith that doesn't get along. And so that is a messy conversation to be had, which in some sense is doubly messy when it's in history and politics and geopolitics and blah, blah, blah. But to say that, oh, well, the Anglo-Saxon British liberalism is the fly in my ointment, and I just want to get back to my geographical, historical determinism, you don't get to fucking do that, okay? Because we are not just material beings. We live, even in an evolutionary sense, we've broken the mold. We live inside our minds. We live inside a collective mind, which you could call culture. And there is relative power within culture. We're not going to all have equal power within culture, because some people, let's say, are more spiritually powerful than other people. And this is not even correlated to material wealth. This is correlated because it's like the Pareto distribution. In other species, the queen of the hive is massive compared to the worker drone. And the worker drone is just a peon. And then you have drones that exist just to mate with the queen. And everyone has, and they have these different biological setups. Human beings are not like that. We all look the same. But my intellect can be completely different to somebody else's intellect. But do I exist? Do I have 50 I might be 50 times more intelligent than somebody else in terms of my ability to do something. I know people say, oh, how impudent, how conceited, or something like that. How hubristic. But I'm saying, there is actually this kind of asymmetry within our species, and you can't see it. You can't see it in the embodiment in some sense. Maybe you can if you have a way to discern it, but you can't. You can get people are going to perceive it differently, and what did the Dutch do to their noblemen and their elites? They fucking ate them. They thought that their elite was getting a bit too unwieldy for them, for their culture, for their society. They fucking cannibalized them because their noblemen thought that they were too good, I guess. And so you have this, the peasants are revolting ambiguity problem. I'm just going to keep on pointing that out. Now, in some sense, you could say, well, Sam Vaknin is just trying to rationalize and get into a real politic, a real historical determinism, getting to grips with the idea that the peasants are revolting. Not that they're revolutionary, but they are literally revolting, and we have to deal with their revoltingness, and they are holding us back. And I'm very sympathetic to that sociological reduction in some sense, but I have a particular plan to deal with it because I invent psychology. I want to advance psychology so that we can actually deal with this problem, so that we can have a better understanding of toxicity in some sense. Now, that can work on a one-on-one individual interaction. It's not going to work as a sociological solution, and in some sense I do want to make room for my theory in the greater hard power structure of things, which will also be a bit of a political problem, because in some sense people don't want to be judged in a very clearly justifiable way. They want to be judged in an imprecise way so that they can be justified in their retributivism, that they can be justified in their reticence. They can be justified in claiming privacy. Because imagine if there was a court that actually could get to the bottom of every matter. If there was a legal system, a justice system that actually that was humble enough that it didn't make rulings when it wasn't sure enough, and it said, well, this issue is not ripe, but we can suggest that this is a mediation because this cannot be judged at this time, if it knew its own limitations or something like that. And it tried to work out. I mean, this is what the British common law, to some degree, has the capacity to do, because the High Court does not just follow regulations. It is not a creature of statute. In some sense, they are weighing between the parties the claims and the counterclaims made between the parties. And they are responsible for how they make those claims and how they engage themselves and participate in the justice system. And therefore, you don't get the justice that you deserve. You get the justice that you sue for, and how you sue for it matters. So you actually have to be in intellectual position to bring these things forward. Now, you could, in some sense, I think that my psychology is a bit more enlightened than just that system, because it's not, I wouldn't say that my system is inquisitorial, but it can assist people in making their own case, or at least in allowing them to see their own workings of how they contributed towards the controversy, and perhaps to see the rift between the two parties, to see the gap, the chasm, as it were. And in some sense, that actually puts a bit of a spanner into some of the adversarial nature of British common law to some degree. But there's something to the adversarial nature that as a default starting point, I think, is important to keep everything functional, to keep the whole procedure and process viable. Because if you rest too much on some kind of inquisitorial aspect of the judge, you are really creating an unsustainable form of infantilism. You are undercutting the development and the moral development and edification of the citizenry itself, in some sense, to be in command and to be sovereign of their own affairs and things like that. So again, I mean, you see how I just go back to Anglo-Saxon British liberalism in some sense, which is the fly in Sam Vaknin's ointment. And I'm just pointing this out, and this is why he rails against it, because it does deflate. You know, he calls it a blip, he calls it a fluctuation or something like that. I say that no, it's going to take over the world. It's going to be the big fire that actually consumes the world in fire, in that fire, because everyone is suffering for the want of that. You think China isn't suffering for the want of that? You think the middle classes in China just want to be ruled by an oligarchy, by an unaccountable politico-plutocracy that farms human beings? You really think that's a viable alternative model in morality? I mean, so I do think that essentially, if we are willing to actually take up the mantle of morality and to actually refine it and hash it out and instantiate it into our hard systems, in some sense, I do think that the real obstacle for stopping that is understanding psychology. Because when psychology is itself just a controversial people shouting at each other from across the hall, and then philosophy also has no grounding, because you need to have psychology needs to be the queen of the sciences. If you don't know what's going on in psychology, you don't know what's going on in academia in general. It's just a kind of, it's a shouting match. It's a competing towers of Babel. And to some degree, I think that I would point to this, that epistemic responsibilism is largely correct. And the fact that people that even extol epistemic responsibilism have developed a very toxic form of epistemic injustice and theories around epistemic injustice, which, by the way, they know that those theories don't work. They are so disgustingly stupid. It is pathetic how they talk about them, how they introduce them in lectures. It's pathetic. It's fucking conjecture. It's hypothetical. It's pathetic. You don't understand how lowbrow, how utter. I mean, to sit through a lecture in epistemic injustice from someone who supposedly understands epistemic responsibilism, it is literally to boil your brain in a vat of acid. It is pathetic. It is the opium of the masses. It is the indoctrination of the brave new world controllers. This is the form in which the brave new world takes is manifesting, and no one has the moral gumption to stand against it because they are so overwhelmed by the narrative of, oh well, we have a climate emergency, so let's just fall in line. We need to centralize the control of carbon. Let's ignore the fact that, so Sam Vaknin says, he informs me whenever I listen to him, because I think almost everything that he says can be perfectly repurposed. I would put a spin of hope onto it. I would put a hopefulness and a morality and a faith on it, and then I can actually do something forthright about these things that he points out. But people forget that essentially government controls, in Sam Vaknin's word, 40% to 70% of the resources in a society. This is a state-driven culture and civilization. Obviously, if we're going to be corrupt, then where's the corruption that exists in the state? They're the majority of the control of the energy. Literally, in a White's law sense of that. The energy in a society literally defines the wealth of per capita of a society, that how cheap energy is. And if energy is going to be controlled primarily in the majority sense by the government, anyway, okay, I brought in White's law, but in some sense, we have to understand that I think we would have a different cultural sensibility right now if government was tiny. If government was small and we had an economic slowdown. By the way, I don't necessarily believe that we would have an economic slowdown, because I do think that if we were, let's say, hyper private capitalistic or whatever, with a good legal system so that we could sue each other for pollution and stuff like that and actually get to the end of the rabbit hole of these issues, and not be tied out in procedural bullshit, and outmaneuvered by people that are richer than us, that have a bigger bank account, so that they can essentially avoid the end of justice. That essentially, if we had a private scale of things, I think we would naturally develop something like Game B, something like private scale communism or something like that, which would hopefully be themselves enclaves or autarkies that try to create an independent economic edifice that related to one another and that understood one another, and that were providing a model to be followed by other people and assisting other people to follow that model. But the problem is that a lot of that will be cultural technology, more so, and psychological technology as well, I believe, which some people might not be interested. And then what can you do with people that don't want to follow your model? What can you do with people that don't want to be like you? That don't like what you represent, they don't like you, and they're not interested? Well, this is why we should have a market. This is why we should have a secular part of society, and why we should always preserve that as a default, so that we don't have to create an indoctrination camp, that we don't have to indoctrinate people, that you can leave if you want to leave. And in some sense, we don't just want to say, well, stay or go. We want to say, well, maybe we don't have it right as well, and we're capable of improving. And so it's not a fixed system. It's not as, and this is the problem, is that if you try to make a game B, it can't be too hard. It can't be too soft. it has to be just right. It has to be a kind of Goldilocks sort of thing. And I do think that there have to be hard scaffolding structures, like a justice system. You have to have something like that, and you have to have something like that that isn't stupid enough that it can just kind of be taken over by an ideological authoritarian tyranny or something like that. But in some sense, to other people, it will already look like that. It'll look like a cult. To the outside, it will look like a fucking cult. There's no getting around that. And obviously, you don't want the cult to be too, you don't want to be like, let's say, like the Amish, that essentially, if you just build your barn in a different fucking shape, then you get shunned, and you get shunted and you get snubbed, and you get expelled from the society. I mean, we, at least in the West, I think, with the British liberal spirit, will say, well, that's a bit pathetic. But you can understand why they created those rules, because they don't know where to draw the line, and they don't know where to draw the line. They admit that they don't know where to draw the line, and basically the Amish are very similar to Islam in that sense. Do you know that Islam, in some sense, they don't care about what's going on in your head? It's like behaviorism. They just want you to do the righteous thing, which is defined by their Sharia law to a large extent. So pray 5 times a day. It doesn't matter if you think you're, but you pray 5 times a day. Just do it. Just do it. Just do it. And then you'll believe it eventually, probably. But if you want to have crazy private thoughts that are sinful, there is no such thing as sinful thoughts in Islam. I mean, it is to the general common believer. And I do think that there are forms of Islam that, in some sense, some Islamic people try to become Christian as well, because there are parts of the Quran that very explicitly says that God will not allow his messengers and his message to be destroyed. And the Gabriel Hadith very clearly says that the Injil is part of the message. And I think some people know that the Injil is not in the Quran, that it is a different aspect. And a lot of people know that they need to integrate that. But anyway, I mean, but that's also perhaps apocalyptica in some sense, because they also believe that Isa will come and show them things. But my point here about Islam is just that the theory is that the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And then by extrapolation, you compare what you're not allowed to do to a modern thing, because society changes. It's kind of like, I mean, Islam is all about social engineering to some degree. And so the law in Islam has been developed by metaphor, by metaphorical extrapolation. It's actually, there are 3 principles. It must be irrational. You're not allowed to rationalize the extrapolation, because then you're interpreting the law. You're not allowed to interpret the law in Islam. It's very difficult to be a scholar in Islam. In some sense, I think to be a scholar in Islam, you're no longer Muslim in some sense, because now by definition, you are interpreting the whole system in some sense. And if you cannot get every other scholar to agree with you, then relative to one scholar, another scholar is an apostate. So all the scholars are apostates relative to one another, to some degree, or relative to one another, unless you want to say that one scholar has got it right, and all the people that agree with him have got it right, and everyone else that doesn't agree with him have got it wrong. And that whole schism, in some sense, is the problem that you get with the Amish. It's the same problem. This is the same problem in a different cultural manifestation, in some sense. But you can understand the value that Islam is providing in the world, in some sense, because you can understand that there's symbolic concatenation is a useful way of knowing things, is another way that you can. Some people are not thinkers. They see symbolic things. They have a living memory of the prophets. I mean, this is, it's almost like the whole. I mean, this was all from Ishmael and the blood feud between the brothers, between Jacob and Ishmael, and this is that they both claim the birthright, and in some sense Ishmael, even to make sure that he got the birthright, the bloodline of Esau was combined with the bloodline of Ishmael. So I mean, do they both have the I would say that they both have the birthright, but there needs to be an integration on some level. Um, and they can both make special claims about the different system, because there is something there was real disagreement between, when I say disagreement, but there was a real different way of thinking. There was a different way of conceiving of the law between these brothers and the blood feud. And this is a schism that naturally is in the mind, in the psychology, in the consciousness of human beings, because we have different gifts, we have different spiritual gifts, we have different capacities. And in some sense, I do think that part of the history of the world is to, and Islam actually goes quite deeply into this, that God has given different tasks and different messages to different people. And that is because the world needed to grow, to express, to manifest sin. Because we cannot fix sin until it's properly manifested. It has to be ripe for the reaping in some sense. You cannot redeem something that doesn't even know itself to some degree. It has to explore. It has to literally, you need some level of specialization before you can actually have a synthesis. You can't just jump to the synthesis. You have to go through the thesis and the antithesis. And so a lot of history is this, so I mean, in some sense, I'm a Hegelian. I mean, I say this, and I haven't really, I mean, I think at one point in my life I read Hegel when I was like 10 years old or something like that, or someone read it to me, or they showed me parts of it. But probably closer to Hegel than I am to Marx. But anyway, and Slavoj Žižek has always tried to get on my case with what's his name. He always talks about him. The psychological person who, oh my word, this is embarrassing. I can't even remember who Slavoj Žižek always talks about. He's actually started talking about him less, or at least I haven't heard Slavoj Žižek talk that often. But sorry, I'm saying so many things at the same time. But if people will know who I mean. He always talks about that psychologist who's basically like a Marxist psychologist or whatever. Who somehow was famous famous in the Eastern Bloc or something like that. But I mean, whenever I talked to Slavoj Žižek, he was always like, "No, you must read this guy. You must read this guy." And I guess I was never interested, or I was never kind of on that level, because I'm studying psychology myself in my original thesis, and that I don't want to be poisoned by other people's sort of. But now I guess I feel like I could read that and then probably be critical about it, and explain how. I mean, a lot of this problem is like when you're in this kind of Freudian psychodynamic sort of theory about stuff. I think it's too loose, it's too up in the air, it's too sort of unbounded in this kind of endless cacophony of this unconsciousness, which is like never has a resolution to it or something like that. And then, yes, you can say interesting mechanics around repression and stuff like that, but it doesn't really lead to a synthesis. In fact, the synthesis that you get out of that kind of loose thinking is a very, very mild form of vaccine to the last immediate problem, which then produces, let's say, a vulnerability to the new looming, let's say, disaster that you are, because you don't know what you're doing in some sense. I do think that Marxism is actually a pretty good analogy for this, because Marxism, I mean, perhaps I've reinterpreted Marxism to some degree, but I do like to think that even if Marx joined the bandwagon at the end of his life, he has enough insight that can be sort of repurposed to understanding the limitation of his own ideological narrative. So his own ideological narrative, in some sense, all narratives are going to be toxic. And in some sense, I think that the essence of Marx's work kind of amounts to this, that essentially you have to know what it is that you're doing consciously. Because if you don't do it consciously, I mean, this is, I think, the general sort of theme, you're just going to end up repeating the unconscious dialectical tension that you haven't consciously taken into account or something like that, and you're going to end up, let's say, repeating stages of history, which I take more metaphorically because I think that it's less about historical materialism and determinism than it is psychological determinism. So I do think that there's a psychological determinism essentially, which I'll again say the Anglo-Saxon British liberalism I think is the only kind of way to actually get out of that. And by the way, I don't think it would necessarily just be. I don't think that the British are particularly smart or clever about this. I think that the Roman Dutch law and even the Dutch society was also very spiritually alive. They invented capitalism, the Dutch. They invented multinational corporations. They invented finance. And they did this while they were a fucking colony of Belgium or something, or France, I can't remember. But they were their currency, the Dutch currency, was more sought after than their host nation because they essentially found a way to tap into commerce. They found a way to actualize the energies of people. I mean, they basically they end. Do you want to know who ended mercantilism? It was the Dutch ended mercantilism with a new model. I kind of have a recording about that, but anyway, I don't want to get into that. But in some sense, Sam Vaknin knows how to deal with mercantilism. He doesn't know how to understand something that breaks the mold of mercantilism, so he attacks everything, or he criticizes everything as being a blip on the radar, and we should go back to the lowest common denominator where everything makes sense to as determinism. Sorry, let me just go back to Marxism. So, Marxism is what I see Marxism. I mean, so you see, I'm everything. I consider myself a radical Marxist and a classical libertarian. And I can synthesize both of these things. I see no contradiction in doing that. There's a time and a place for everything. I want to create a responsible substate within my liberal Western democracy that essentially is a game B substate, and I will do this so that I can have functional independence, so that I can proselytize my model to other people, and not just offer technology to people. You don't say, oh, this is how you make a fusion bomb, this is how you make a fusion reactor. No, you don't give that to people. You enculturate them first, and you give them other technology maybe, if they want to become like you, if they do want to assimilate. But that kind of assimilation is not going, in some sense, I don't want to force people to assimilate into my system. If I can call it my system, it would be more than just me. The model of the system that I would want to be a part of. I would also say that maybe I would keep society alive. I would keep capitalism alive because I wouldn't want to end capitalism because maybe those people don't want to join me and I don't want to force them to join me. I don't want people on my doorstep that have no choice about being on my doorstep. I don't want people to come begging on my culture. That's going to be weird. If you want something from me, then you should want to be like me. Otherwise, we can have diplomatic relations and cordial relations. But I don't want to have any kind of coercive thing here, even in the extent to which that I will try to offer advice to how you can fix your political system. I will offer advice as to how you can fix the hard structures of power within your system and just tell you why you're fucking up so badly. So I will give you some free advice maybe that I consider to be not poisonous to some degree, because I'm not going to just give you advice that's going to help you fix your problem but end up doubling down on the moral deficiency, which is essentially the kind of progress that we have in Western democracy, which is somewhat doubling down on what I would call a form of institutionalized corruption, which is why I rally and rant so much about the terrible legal systems and things like that, especially the terrible legal system in continental Europe, the Napoleonic corruption, which essentially exists in America as well. Which is why I say that these people, they deserve their constitutional crises, or at least in America in some sense. America America is in a better state than continental Europe. Continental Europe has a rotten legal structure. It has a rotten legal tradition. It works. It's functional, but it's culturally dead. The cultures in Europe have been corrupted thoroughly by Napoleon in some sense. They all bear the mark of the Napoleonic corruption. I mean, Germany kind of gets away with it because they infantilize their people. Because when you go to court, the rules are all in alignment. The rules make sense. They've been created by intelligent elites. They've been crafted in backrooms. They look far afield. The Germans are so responsible, their elites, when they do this. They study the law all over the world, and then they kind of concatenize it. They compile it into a symbolic, let's say, regulatory framework, and then they will do surveys and they'll update their regulatory frameworks to the kind of the best practice, so that they can just they can orientate their society to be very, very efficacious, very, very efficient, but they're not willing to actually do the work of developing it in-house. So somewhat there's a bit of a cultural, in the same way that America is creating the new drugs for everyone. I mean, I'm not saying that that's the best way to do it, but there is some truth to that all the socialized medicine systems in the world somewhat are get free drug development because capitalism in medicine still functions in America. So all the socialized anyway. But I mean, Trump kind of put an end to that when he said that essentially, what is it, the lowest common denominator price, or like if you sell a drug for that much overseas, you have to sell it for the same price in the country. You have to take the lowest price. So you either have to raise the price to overseas clients, or you have to lower the price locally and find a middle ground. So Trump actually fixed that. So that's how corrupt the American system is. But people don't realize it, and they also can't even see in front of them when they've got a politician that actually is doing the right thing and that is actually cutting against the vested interest. They're so blinded by their media narrative and by their climate change, moral panic, and fake journalism. Anyway, moving on. They still call Trump racist. With record minority unemployment, they still call him racist. It's crazy. And they don't listen to his speeches. They just decontextualize everything that he says. They said that, he said that supposedly coronavirus was a hoax. But what did he actually mean when he said that coronavirus is a hoax? Was he talking about how the media was reporting about it and trumping it up as an overreaction, which actually caused much more? I mean, the government reaction to coronavirus is probably worse than the virus itself. That's eminently true, I would say. But also, I mean, Trump had already put a travel ban against China because of the coronavirus. And then he calls it a hoax in terms of how it's being reported on. And then that gets decontextualized into him saying that coronavirus is a conspiracy theory and that it's not even a real virus. I mean, this is how fine-tuned the propaganda machine is in America, how they can contort reality and decontextualize anything and anyone to mean and to say anything. And you can say, well, Trump deserves that because he talks in a very intuitive way. Well, okay, I've made this argument before, but let me just reiterate it here. This is why Trump is the antidote to these problems. Because Trump doesn't say things that are correct in the letter of what he says. He says them correctly if you just interpret them charitably. If you just literally just use your own value system. He's not telling you what your values should be. He's saying, no, that's axiomatic. We should all not be racist. So interpret what I'm saying in a non-racist way, because I say things in a bit of a blunt situation. I'm just saying it as I see it. This is how I talk. This is my vernacular. If you want to interpret that I'm a racist, that's fucking your projection, darling. That's your projection, Mr. SJW, or Mr. Or Mrs. Feminist, misanthropic projectionism of the left, in some sense, gets to have a field day at Donald Trump because they can just kind of, it's like a magic 8 ball. You just shake it up and you say, that's what he said. Anyway, that's kind of the point that I'm making. But this is the problem with narratives. Anyway, I was talking about Marx. Let me go back to Marx. So Marxism becomes its own narrative, becomes its own formulaic recipe, becomes its own magical thinking of the ends justify the means, and then it's poisonous. But another reduction that you can make from Marx, in some sense, is quite clearly he didn't know what the solution was. He even said, he warned, he said, I can't predict the future. Capitalism could evolve a different way, and then everything changes. But so he was even compelled by his followers or by the bandwagon to produce a kind of recipe, to produce a formula, which he shouldn't have done. But he did place caveats when he made these predictions, and in some sense, I think he was very misled by looking at the state in his time. The state in his time grew. The bureaucracy of the state grew, which also makes sense then why he had such a hard on for the vanguard and for the what are they called, the revolutionary fuck, I can't remember the term, the socialistic vanguard that would be the Lenin harped onto this. What the fuck was it called? So I'm about to sneeze. What did Lenin call them? The dictatorship of the proletariat was the Marxist term, and then obviously Leninism became sort of outright vanguardism in that image. But essentially, this notion still exists in many different strains of revolutionary. That you need to have a dictatorship of the proletarian. Now, this makes sense if you lived in Marx's time, because in Marx's time, the state looked like it was the hub of commerce. In fact, the state was the hub of commerce. It bureaucratically indicated to people how they should organize their capital to some degree. And they kind of made room for markets far afield because of colonialism and things like that. But so the state was part of orchestrating the market, and the state were almost embedded in one another, and that trend has only grown, sadly, because we don't have the hard legal structures to kind of divorce them, because we've got a corrupted, institutionalized corruption to some degree. But the problem is that capitalism does need to collaborate with itself to some degree. Otherwise, you do get wasted investment. But you can do that. You can do that in chambers of commerce. You don't have to do that through the state. You could do that through soft state structures where people have round tables of stakeholders coming together and discussing and roughly managing sort of things in collaboration. But and having some kind of maybe you could impose some kind of transparency on certain markets so that there's a certain kind of, so you don't get overcapitalization maybe, or something like that. Anyway, but there is a bit of an art to commerce that can be brokered, or something like that you don't need to. Anyway, what's my point? I'm talking about Marxism. I'm talking about the dictatorship of the proletarian. And yeah, in some sense, I think that whole concept was dreamt up because in Marx's day, the state expanded a hundredfold. It grew like a leviathan, and it became more and more important for organizing. But in some sense, that was before communications technology. That was before decentralized computers and things like that. I mean, so the state needed to have this kind of scholarly bureaucratic apparatus to just administer and keep track of things, and it was impossible to make intelligent investment decisions because you would have to gain access to the data that was being collated by the state to some degree in order to invest intelligently, and the elite would do that. Now it's capable of you're capable of decentralizing this, and you can also, so in some sense you could say that like we need a little bit of a reform within capitalism to let's say deleverage the power that the elites have over an institutionalized corrupt system. they're not going to like that, especially with all the kind of power that they have. But to a large extent, we have to realize also that a lot of these regulations that are supposedly designed to protect people and protect the environment are there to create enough red tape that you can't enter the market. It's too costly to enter the market. You need a legal team, you need compliance officers, you need regulation, you know, it's too much. And the identity politics is going to make this even worse, because now if you have to have kind of weird segregational sensitivity training and bullshit. I mean, this is just, big companies love this because it means that essentially it's like protection money. It's like paying the mafia to never have competition, because you don't really have to worry so much about the competition from other medium-sized people that are the same size as you, because then they're going to be as inefficient as you are. Usually in a market, you have to worry about the small competitor that's growing because they've got a niche, they've got a new technology, they've got a new business formula, and they are more agile than you are because you've grown fat and bureaucratic. So the big companies are always fat and bureaucratic. So it's always wonderful for them to add more red tape onto the business model, because it's just basically protection money. They don't mind it. They see it as protecting their market. It's basically insurance, that they are getting a license from the state to control and corner their market. And this is why the cost of living has increased so much. You know, people complain, oh, I'm not earning enough money. I'm not being paid enough by my bullshit company that isn't paying me enough money. The problem is not that you're being underpaid. The problem is that the cost of living is out of control, and it's never going to come down. And the reason why it's never going to come down is because the state is fucking inefficient as fuck, and it's destroying everything, and it's stopping new competitors from getting to market. I mean, you can't even make a business anymore because business property is so expensive, because rent is too expensive. Just to live, you know, like we're being strangled. We're being literally strangled by the taxation, the form that taxation takes. But also, this is because of the looming cost of this bloated state-controlled economy that is so institutionally corrupt. It's disgusting, and this is why we don't have growth in a third world country. Well, in South Africa. South Africa is, I think, the only sub-Saharan African nation that isn't growing, because our government is so corrupt, and because there's so much money to steal from the people that are the right color that you're allowed to steal from them. And then you can steal from those people that have that color skin, and then you can still blame them for why the country isn't growing. So it's a double win. You know, it's never ending unaccountable politics. This is what we get from identity politics. Thank you, America. Thank you for fucking up a developing nation that was trying to transform itself with your poisonous legal moral filth, and your disgusting legal scholars and your moral midgets that come over here. And you know, I mean, they come in all sorts. You know, even the Christian missionaries come from America to teach us about identity politics. Get your racist Nazi philosophy out of my country. Thank you very much. Go have your own constitutional crisis. We actually have a non-racialist constitution here. It's technically against the law. It's against the supreme law of the land to talk racial nonsense like that, and to be an academic supposedly in race and gender studies and preach this kind of Nazi filth. You should be ashamed. And by the way, if there is a calamity in this country, I will definitely be pushing for a Nuremberg trial where you are put in the ranks of those people to be tried with all the other judges that push this filth. Anyway, my emotional discharge aside, Marxism. So what was I going to say about Marxism? The dictatorship of the proletariat. And, you know, it fails every time, by the way. I mean, if you just look at, you know, they just become a new aristocracy unto themselves, and the ends justify the means, and they just become a new nomenclatura, and they develop their own coordinator class elite. And then they justify it as well, because they say, well, we're more noble than the plebs. Because you've kicked out the ladder to your aristocracy. You've kicked out the ladder to your sovereignty, which becomes a private affair, which grows conspicuously hypocritical, because, you know, as the nomenclatura in Russia, they were consuming Western goods. I mean, they had Western perfume, they had Western cars, they had Western luxury. You know, I mean, how were they even different from the Russian aristocracy? ironic. But the Russian aristocracy, the original Russian aristocracy, I think, did actually have, they were willing to compromise. They were willing to reform the system. And even as they were willing to make those reforms, they were wiped out. And Western culture, the engine of Western culture, the heart of Europe was Moscow, and it was strangled by the Russian Revolution. And in some sense, that was a German plot to some degree. A lot of dark things come out of Germany for some reason. But I think that's because they infantilize their people, and they just are raw power maniacs. They just want to, their nobility, they really infantilize their own people. They're not willing to have this cultural production within themselves. It's very hollow. Um, I don't mean to shit on the Germans, but I think that there are a lot of German people, or at least German jurists, who might understand what I'm saying here. I mean, there's a cost in German society that is not often seen, which, in some sense, uh, things are connected in a psychological way. And there are some people in German society who have tremendous hardship in their family life. Let me just put it like that. And they don't realize, and this is a weird way to put it, but it is also true. But I'm not going to unpack this as much as I perhaps should. But we have to understand that the sins of a society, the sins of a culture, the sins of the father that is visited on the child, the tacit environment that we live in, it gets driven in to the new generation. It has to be imbibed by the new generation. It has to be taught to them. And some individuals within a society are sensitive. They are highly intelligent, perhaps. They are highly agile. And they are being infected by a program which is not fair to their psychology. But they have to fit the mold. And so you get these literal, you could say that, well, in Africa there's a lot of problems for many different reasons, maybe for cultural reasons, also for lack of material comfort. But when you live in a first world country which has, let's say, safety rails in place, where there, in some sense, there's no materialistic deficiency. I mean, there's disparity, but there's no, let's say, egregious. Um, there's still possibility for envy, but there's no possibility, let's just say, for starving in the street or something like that, unless if you put yourself there because you're on a you're on a drug binge or something like that. If you go crazy and you do something insane to yourself, but in a society, and I'm making a convoluted point there, I guess, but um, the motif that I'm trying to draw is that how we treat our children in a society, I think, um, is not a perfect thermometer for what's going on in a culture. Um, but it is the point at which, at some point, we have to fix that. I said that in a very weird way because I don't think that we don't fix society by making the government adopt everyone as a child and then fix their childhood upbringing. You can't do that. You can't arrest culture in that way. You have to actually teach people to be better parents. That you how you protect children is that you educate people to become better parents, but you also can't necessarily just educate people to become better parents, because then you have to solve their problems for them, and you can't just solve other people's problems for them. You have to also make them understand that there is a real opportunity that they can solve their own problems and that they should want to do that. Because you can't just undercut people that are not interested in developing. You can't just undercut people that are not invested in wanting something different. Maybe they don't want something different. Maybe they want it to be just the way it is. And there's let's say there's malevolence in that, or there's a calcified trauma in that. And yes, you could say that yes, everything is trauma that's being passed down through the generations. Blah blah blah. I mean, I don't believe in that reductionism. I do think that the individual needs to be rebuked. The individual does need to be morally put on a pedestal and questioned. Obviously, not questioned in an invidious way, not in a pernicious way, but in a truthful way, in some sense. And in some sense, if people don't incline towards the values of self-criticism or self-invigilation, if they're not interested in developing humility, then there's going to be no hope to some degree. And humility is a weird sort of thing. So, I mean, I can imagine that people would describe me as the most unhumble person that you can imagine. So, I'm sensitive to labels and semantics and words, which is why I generally would conceive it as having that you need negative values, not positive values, because then we can hash out our negative values and come to a point of agreement that we can start to have a realistic negotiation and communication from a kind of lowest common denominator that then we can build a common reality around. I'm interested in doing that because I think that that's the only way that we get anywhere real, by building a shared reality, and then we have to work out the point at which we can both agree as a starting point. And some people aren't even capable of having a starting point because their narrative is so poisonous. They have so many very shitty epistemic injustice ideological concepts running around in their head. They have too many lived experiences that tell them no. And if you want to reify lived experiences, then I think that essentially you're not a moral entity. You've given up your self-determinism. You don't have free will at that point. If you want to say that you have lived experiences that tell you X, Y, Z, I mean, first of all, that's not. I don't even buy that bullshit, by the way, because people have varied lived experiences, and their lived experiences is not just what happens to them externally, it's what they do to themselves in the interior mentality. And their lived experience, I would say, is 90% them reacting to their external experiences. And I know that that sounds like a very harsh, high, transcendental standard, but until you kind of have a self-ownership on that level, you're really no different than an animal to a large extent. You've given up your own dignity. You're saying, I'm not free-willed, I'm conditioned. So if you want to have a conversation with another human being and your whole premise for the conversation is that I'm not free-willed, I'm conditioned, then go find other people to be conditioned with, I guess, that you can get along with. Go put yourself out to pasture. Go be a segregationalist. Go be a balkanist. Go balkanize and be an apartheid person, because that's obviously the kind of mentality that you attain to, that you're striving to get towards. And why? Because some social justice retard has told you that it's okay to do that. Some social justice Nazi has told you that that is a moral schema that is worth adopting because sympathy, everyone should have sympathy for everyone else's fucking narrative. Go to hell. And I mean that almost quite in the literal. Because that's what you're making on earth. You're making a hell on earth. Don't bring your stories to the table. We're trying to build a better world. We're trying to actually do something. We're trying to get somewhere. We're trying to be transformative. And your mentality is not transformative. It's fucking Nazi society. So go fuck off and go make your own ethno-state if you want to do that. But don't call it the New South Africa. Don't call it constitutional. Call it what it is. It's a betrayal. It's a betrayal of morality. It's a betrayal of values. And you are a disgusting human being, moral slime, and I don't fucking care. You deserve your rebuke. You deserve your crazy society that you're going to make. You deserve your pathetic You know how stupid the Nazis were making themselves with their fucking mythology of blood and soil? I mean, it's a pathetic religion. It's a way of creating an idolatry around a cherry-picked history which can't even be honest about its own history. It has to mythologize it to make themselves the stolen. Everything was stolen from us. Everything belonged to us first, and it was stolen away from us. So that you put on your blinders, you put on your fucking tunnel vision. Now, I guess I can be called a hypocrite because I sing the praises of the Anglo-Saxon liberal British philosophy or something like that. I mean, look, if you want me to sing a lullaby to you about how there are virtues and of many different cultures and many different creeds, and they can be synthesized and integrated, I can do that. I really can do that because there is a lot of value all over the place. But if we're not willing to synthesize it, if you're only going to say, if you want to say my culture did something really really special and it's unique to my culture and there's nothing like it anywhere else or something like that, I mean, there might be something to that. But if you're not willing to integrate it, if you're not willing to synthesize it, I mean, what are you? You're just a fucking racist. I mean, really, you don't want to be part of humanity. You want to be part of your own special breed. You want to be a special, it's like, I mean, this is the fascistic dog mentality that you want to be a very particular form of something. You want to be specialized. I mean, the specialization that I have, I offer to other people, and I think it can be understood and it can be shared. So I'm trying to jailbreak what I think I've seen because I've actually looked all over the place. I've integrated all over the place. I've actually explored. I've been curious. I've investigated. That's how I think I'm justified in making the claims that I've made because I have open eyes, as it were. And my eyes are still open, and I might be wrong. So inform me how I might be wrong, and let's discuss it. But let's do it in a way where we're not being uncareful, we're not being unserious, and we're not being untruthful. Because I have an ear for untruthfulness. And perhaps you could say, well, I'm peculiar and too specialized and particularized in the biases that I've accumulated from all my highfalutin studies of these things. And then help me understand if you've got a way to disentangle me from my self abuse or something like that. And maybe I am prone to things that I need to shed. Maybe maybe there's a better understanding that I could come to. Help me integrate it, perhaps. But if you're not willing to lend that kind of help, then just be honest about it. That you've got a separate project, or maybe you've heard something about me that you just can't countenance. You just can't reconcile your mind to it. And I mean, I can't help you there. I mean, so you know, if you're not willing to engage, if you're not willing to negotiate, I can't. I mean, if I mean, a lot of people will say, well, you just sound crazy. I mean, I think I do sound crazy, but that I think is because most people are very fucking retarded, and they like their retardation because it allows them to incline themselves towards uh, a kind of nescience, a kind of safe nescience that allows them to perpetrate and to continue their wicked um, form of self repression to some degree that allows them to deal in their coping mechanisms and things like that. Um, and look, I do realize that a lot of this is not helpful to many people, can't access what I'm talking about because it actually does require, for some people, it does require a bit of a cultural enlightenment. It does, some people, they cannot necessarily get a direct individual understanding without, let's say, therapeutic engagement, or at least have living in a culture that has a better sensibility, a better dream, a better atmosphere, a better ethos, a better education system that is working in a more synergistic, dynamic way. But I mean, and I think that sadly, the reason why we're not living in such a society because we've kind of paid for that society. South Africa has certainly paid for that society, but we were betrayed by a government that is fundamentally institutionally corrupt and by a political system that's not willing to hold them accountable, and they are letting them get away with a kind of political unaccountability fueled by racialism, by naked fascistic racialism, which comes from us from the West, which is this noxious identity politics that has destroyed our political system because as it has destroyed journalism. And I mean, I have names to name about that as well. Names that should be sued for constitutional damages, names that should either be in prison or should at least be barred from taking a dime from the public purse, and that should not be given any airways on the public broadcasting services or whatever. These people should be criminals. They should not be on public radio. But, this is how far out we've gotten, because we've normalized this kind of corruption. And in some sense, people don't even complain about the corruption. They complain that we're not radical enough in our economic policy. It's like, it's a complete misnomer. They just mislabel the symptom. Essentially, they say, "Oh, the problem is capitalism." Not that we have a corrupt government and institutionalized corruption. It's that that capitalism is the corruption. I mean, it's fucking crazy. It's schizophrenic. I mean, this because well, we have to end capitalism anyway because of the climate crisis. It's that kind of conflated reductionist sociological generalization, and then you just pepper it in with some psychological bullshit terms like implicit bias, and you just pepper it with all of this bullshit that you can't. I mean, what is an implicit bias? I mean, it's literally the Jewish conspiracy theory that the Nazis complained about. I mean, what is the difference between implicit bias and the conspiracy against the Aryan race by the Jews? It's the same fucking ideological thing. It just has different window dressing. While everything else is destroyed, and then that destruction gets redirected towards the ideological scapegoat. Now, America is not going to have a white genocide. They're not in trouble. South Africa could have a white genocide where the population... I mean, look at Julius Malema. He's a full-blown fucking fascist. Do you think he hasn't read Mein Kampf? He uses it like a fucking instruction manual. I'm not even joking. He very clearly is following Mein Kampf like an instruction manual. I don't have personal knowledge that he has in fact read it, but I cannot believe that he hasn't read it, because he is literally following it like a fucking instruction manual to the fucking T. He is literally following it like an instruction manual. Just listen to 5 speeches of Julius Malema. He is the black reincarnation of fucking Hitler. I'm not exaggerating. That's a metaphor, by the way. That's a fucking metaphor. So in some sense, I'm saying that I believe that he has read Mein Kampf. I don't know that he has, but I can't believe that he hasn't, because he's using it like a fucking instruction manual. That is his behavior. It's following it to the fucking T. So I put these things together. And I make the claims that I make. I would say I'm justified in those beliefs. I mean, in some sense, I just say that I believe that I don't know what he's actually done, but he's following it like a... Anyway, I mean, I guess you could say, look at his behavior. Look at his behavior. Am I wrong? Is this not the reincarnation of Hitler? That's a metaphor. Anyway, I'm pointing this out. And by the way, Hitler was also a very popular European leader before the war. Before the war, Democrats in America fucking loved Hitler, just like they fucking probably loved Julius Malema. So I'm pointing this out, that the same bullshit has happened before, and you haven't fucking learnt your historical lesson yet, because you live in a fucking institutionalized cesspit of a legal structure and a legal tradition. Fix your fucking constitutional crisis. Because Trump actually does deserve to be the president, probably. Because as far as I can tell, the election was fucking stolen. Or at least it was controversial enough that the whole election result is fucking dubious as fuck. But anyway, and now I'm being a bit flagrant here. But, you've got serious problems in America. But people don't care. Because as long as the narrative that they care about is served, that's all they care about. They don't actually care about the substantive legal component. Because they live in a substantive legal system where the law itself is trial and error, because they'll just remake it. If the law is fucked up, then the state legislatures need to fix their state constitutions, and they need to make new legislation that governs the electoral process in each state, because it's trial and error. I mean, it just shows you... I mean, you can't have trial and error substantive law that governs the elections. I mean, that already is a constitutional crisis in a nutshell. I mean, how can you... The thing that actually governs the appointment of people who get to make decisions over... Anyway, I mean, you can see that that's a fucking conundrum. That's a paradox. But anyway, sadly, this is what happens when you claim independence before you know how to make a fucking constitution. Anyway, I'm not complaining too much because history is messy, and it's not as if America hasn't been a force for good. So I'm not making a blanket. Anyway, I've put enough caveats on these things. I expect to be taken into context. I've made a lot of videos about these topics, and I've tried to give both sides of the conversation, or both sides of the issue. But really, what it comes down to is that certain things need to be changed, certain things need to be fixed, and that's all I care about is fixing the problems on the ground in present time. I don't care about history. I don't care about. You cannot repair history. It's what is done is done. You can deal with the aftermath in the most responsible, effective way possible. And you get people that don't want to do that because they're fucking corrupt, or they're morally corrupt, or they don't understand, or a combination of those three. And that's what I'm basically pointing to. And a large component of corruption, I'll say, is sympathy, because that's how you disguise corruption. Is you do it because you're trying to do the right thing. You tell people that you're trying to do the right thing. And I'm just saying, no, that trick is the never-ending cacophony of the snake shedding its skin, and it's continuing to be a forked-tongued serpent. Anyway, I'm going to stop this rant now.